The weekend was supposed to be perfect. I had been looking forward to spending uninterrupted time with my boyfriend, Charles, after weeks of barely seeing each other. When he invited me over, my heart danced with excitement. I imagined lazy mornings in his arms, deep conversations, and maybe a romantic dinner under the stars. But all those fantasies shattered the moment I stepped into his apartment and saw another man sitting comfortably on the couch. "This is my friend, Andrew," Charles introduced with a grin, his arm lazily draped over my shoulders. "He's spending the weekend, too." My heart sank. The weekend, too? Andrew was tall, dark, and undeniably handsome. His presence dominated the space in a quiet yet powerful way. He stood and gave me a polite nod, his deep brown eyes unreadable. I forced a smile, but disappointment coiled in my chest. I wanted Charles to myself. Instead, I now had to share him with Andrew. The first night was awkward. Charles seemed oblivious to my irritation, laughing and drinking with Andrew, as if I wasn't even there. By the time we all retired to bed, my mood had soured. The next morning, I woke up earlier than expected. Deciding to freshen up, I made my way to the bathroom, the tiled floor cool against my bare feet. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open without a second thought. That's when I saw him. Andrew stood in front of the mirror, a towel loosely tied around his waist, his chiseled torso glistening with droplets of water. My breath hitched. The air in the small bathroom grew thick, charged. He turned, surprised, and our eyes met. A jolt of something unfamiliar shot through me. Heat pooled low in my belly as my gaze lingered on his strong, sculpted body. His towel sat dangerously low on his hips, revealing the deep cuts of his V-line. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the doorframe for balance. "Sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But I didn't move. Neither did he. Instead, Andrew took a slow step closer. His scent, earthy and fresh from the shower, wrapped around me like a forbidden embrace. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but silence stretched between us, thick with something neither of us wanted to name. I should have left. I should have turned away. But I didn't. Something had shifted inside me, awakening a curiosity I had never felt before. And from the way Andrew's gaze darkened as it roamed over my body, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. For a moment, time stood still. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension, an energy neither of us had anticipated nor could ignore. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin suddenly too warm. Andrew's gaze lingered on me, searching, waiting. I forced myself to step back, breaking whatever invisible thread had tethered us together. I didn't mean to walk in on you," I murmured, my voice unsteady. Andrew let out a slow breath, his lips curving into a knowing smirk. "No harm done," he said, his voice deep, velvety. "Unless, of course, you wanted to stay." His words sent a fresh wave of heat coursing through me. I swallowed, shaking my head quickly as I turned away, practically fleeing down the hallway. Back in the bedroom, I pressed my palms against my cheeks, trying to cool the warmth burning beneath my skin. What was wrong with me? I was here for Charles, my boyfriend. Yet, the sight of Andrew, dripping wet and half-naked, had shaken something loose inside me, something I wasn't ready to face. By the time I composed myself and joined Charles and Andrew in the living room, the atmosphere felt unchanged, at least for them. Charles was focused on his phone, barely noticing when I sat beside him. Andrew, however, met my gaze across the room, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Had he felt it too? That undeniable pull? "Morning, babe," Charles said, leaning in to kiss my forehead, but the gesture felt different. Or maybe I was different. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. Breakfast was a blur. Charles chatted about his weekend plans that suddenly included leaving me alone with Andrew for a few hours. "I have to step out for a meeting," he said, standing up and stretching. "Didn't think it'd come up, but it's important. You guys will be fine, right?" I hesitated, my gaze darting toward Andrew. He was already watching me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it will be fine," Andrew answered smoothly before I could. Charles kissed my cheek and grabbed his car keys. I'll be back later. You too behave. The second the door shut behind him, the air in the apartment changed. I stood, suddenly restless. I think I'll take a shower. Andrew leaned back against the couch, his dark eyes never leaving me. You sure you won't accidentally walk into the wrong bathroom again? Heat flared in my cheeks.
He was teasing me, testing me.
I lifted my chin. I know exactly where I'm going. Good, he murmured. But as I turned to walk away, I felt his gaze on me, burning into my skin. And I knew, deep down, that whatever had started between us was far from over. I stepped into the shower, hoping the cold water would wash away the lingering tension in my body. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of Andrew, his smirk, his voice, the way he had looked at me like he could see right through me. I ran my hands through my wet hair and exhaled sharply. This is wrong. I was here for Charles.
Charles. My boyfriend.
The man I was supposed to love. And yet, the moment I closed my eyes, it wasn't Charles the first saw. It was Andrew. I groaned in frustration, shutting off the water and wrapping myself in a towel. I needed to get a grip. Drying off quickly, I slipped into a simple tank top and shorts, then stepped out of the bathroom, and nearly bumped into Andrew. He was standing there, arms crossed, his gaze trailing over me in a way that made my stomach tighten. You always seem to be bumping into me, he murmured, a teasing glint in his eyes. I forced out a small laugh, my fingers gripping the towel still wrapped around my damp hair. Maybe you're the one always in my way. His smirk deepened. Maybe. We stood there, inches apart, the air between us thick with something unspoken. My pulse quickened as Andrew reached up, his fingers brushing against the stray drops of water on my shoulder. You're still wet, he said softly. I sucked in a breath. His touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine. My body betrayed me, leaning slightly into him before I caught myself. My voice came out hoarse, unsure. Andrew's eyes searched mine, as if waiting for me to make a decision. To give in. I knew I should step away. I knew I should say something, anything to break whatever was happening between us. But I didn't. And neither did he. Instead, he reached for a stray droplet trailing down my collarbone and caught it with the tip of his finger. My lips parted, my breath shallow. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth, but no words came, because in that moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. My body was betraying me, responding to Andrew's closeness in ways I couldn't control. His finger lingered against my skin, the air between us charged with something neither of us was ready to name. Tell me to stop. The words echoed in my head, but my lips refused to move. I couldn't speak, couldn't step away. I was caught in the pull of something dangerous, something that shouldn't be happening. Andrew's dark eyes studied mine, waiting. His breath was warm against my cheek, his fingers still hovering just above my skin. If I leaned in even a fraction, if I tilted my head the way my body ached to.
No.
With a sharp inhale, I stepped back, breaking the connection between us. I should. My voice cracked slightly. I cleared my throat and tried again. I should go. Andrew let his hand drop to his side, his expression unreadable. But something flickered in his gaze, respect, maybe. Or was it disappointment? A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but this time, it wasn't teasing. It was knowing. Good choice, he murmured. I turned on my heel and walked away before I did something reckless, my heart hammering against my ribs. Back in the bedroom, I leaned against the door, squeezing my eyes shut. My breathing was uneven, my body still buzzing with unspent energy. What the hell just happened? I had never felt this way before. Not with Charles. Not with anyone. And that scared me. I shouldn't be attracted to Andrew. I shouldn't be thinking about him, about how close we had been, about how his voice had sent shivers down my spine. I was here for my boyfriend. And yet, Andrew had awakened something inside me that I couldn't ignore. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This ends here. Whatever this tension was, I would bury it. I wasn't the type of woman who betrayed her man.
I had to remind myself of that.
For the rest of the day, I kept my distance. I stayed in the bedroom, only coming out when I absolutely had to. When Charles finally returned, I let out a breath of relief. Having him back was supposed to bring back a sense of normalcy. But that night, as we all sat in the living room watching a movie, I could feel Andrew's gaze on me. Not pressing, not demanding, just watching. At one point, when Charles got up to grab a drink, Andrew leaned in just enough for only me to hear. "You think walking away changes what happened?" His voice was low, smooth, sending a fresh wave of heat through me. "It doesn't." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the screen. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered back, my fingers tightening around the edge of my dress. Andrew let out a quiet chuckle, his breath warm against my ear. "Liar." A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't look at him. I couldn't, because deep down I knew he was right. I thought walking away from Andrew would be enough, that avoiding him would smother whatever had sparked between us in that bathroom. I was wrong, because Andrew wasn't making it easy. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to grab some water, still in my sleepwear, an oversized t-shirt and shorts. I expected to have a moment to myself, to gather my thoughts before facing Charles. But there he was, Andrew, standing by the fridge, shirtless. Again. His sweatpants hung low on his hips, revealing a deep V-line that made my throat go dry. A sheen of sweat glistened on his chest, his muscles flexing slightly as he reached into the fridge for a bottle of water. He must have just finished a morning workout because his skin glowed with warmth, his breath slightly heavy. He twisted the cap off and took a slow sip, Adam's apple bobbing. My traitorous eyes followed the movement before I caught myself. "Look away. Look away." I turned to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, inhaling deeply. "Morning." His deep voice rumbled behind me. I forced a neutral tone. "Morning." I could feel his eyes on me, assessing, teasing. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. I swallowed.
"Yeah."
"Liar." Andrew let out a quiet chuckle. "You sure? You looked restless last night." My grip tightened on the counter. Had he been watching me? I turned to glare at him, but that was a mistake. Because now he was leaning against the fridge, arms crossed, biceps flexing. His smirk was lazy, knowing. Damn him. I forced my expression to stay indifferent. "I don't know what you're talking about." Andrew tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes holding mine. "You don't have to lie to me." I opened my mouth to respond, but Charles's voice called from the hallway. "Babe, you in there?" I blinked, snapping back to reality. "Yeah, I'm in the kitchen," I called back, my voice a little too high. Andrew's smirk deepened, but he didn't say another word. Instead, he took another sip of water, his gaze lingering on me just a second too long before he finally turned and walked away, leaving me breathless. For the rest of the day, it was a game. Andrew wasn't outright flirting. He never touched me. He never said anything inappropriate. But he didn't have to. He knew exactly what he was doing. Like when he stretched on the couch, his toned stomach peeking from beneath his loose tank top, his fingers lazily running through his hair. Or when he'd come out of the shower, towel slung low around his hips, completely unbothered by my presence. Each time, I forced myself to not react, to not look, to not feel. But my body had other plans. I was aware of him, constantly. Every time he walked into a room, my pulse spiked. Every time our eyes met, my stomach tightened. And the worst part? He knew. That evening, after Charles had fallen asleep on the couch, I decided to step outside for some air. The weight of my emotions, the confusion, the guilt, it was suffocating. I leaned against the balcony railing, staring at the night sky, trying to steady my thoughts. Then I heard the door open behind me. I knew who it was before I even turned. Andrew stepped beside me, resting his arms on the railing. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, watching the city lights. After a moment, he sighed. "You're fighting it too hard." I stiffened. Fighting what? He turned his head slightly, looking at me with that unreadable expression.
"This.
Us." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. There is no us, Andrew. His lips twitched as if he found my denial amusing. Then why do you react every time I walk into a room? I hated that he had noticed. I have a boyfriend, I said firmly, as if reminding myself. Andrew nodded. I know. Silence stretched B. I closed my eyes, gripping the railing as if it could steady the storm inside me. I wanted to deny it, to tell Andrew he was wrong, that my feelings for him were nothing but a passing moment of weakness. But I couldn't, because every time he was near, my body betrayed me. Every time he spoke, my heart skipped a beat. And every time our eyes met, I felt something I had no business feeling. I inhaled deeply, my fingers tightening around the cool metal. I don't know what's happening to me, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew didn't gloat, didn't smirk like I expected him to. Instead, he studied me, his dark eyes softer than before. You're human, he said simply. You can't control attraction. I turned to him then, searching his face for something, anything, that would make this easier. But I love Charles, I whispered, as if saying it out loud would somehow erase the emotions crashing over me. Andrew held my gaze, silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, tilting his head slightly. Then why are you out here with me? I sucked in a sharp breath. Because I wanted to be. Because even though I should have walked away, I hadn't. Because he was the one who consumed my thoughts, not Charles. And that realization shook me to my core. Andrew must have seen the battle in my eyes because he didn't press further. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine on the railing, a touch so light, so fleeting, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I should have pulled away. I didn't. Instead, I turned my hand slightly, allowing our fingers to linger, the warmth of his skin seeping into mine. The moment stretched between us, heavy, charged. I won't cross the line, Andrew murmured, his voice deep, sincere. Not unless you ask me to. I exhaled slowly, my chest tightening. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just shook my head. I won't, I whispered. A small smile played on his lips, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't entirely convinced. You say that now, he said, stepping back, releasing my hand. But let's see how long you can resist. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me breathless, shaking, and completely undone. The tension between Andrew and me had become unbearable. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every unspoken word, it was suffocating. I had told myself I wouldn't give in, that I would stay true to Charles, but deep down, I knew I was losing the battle. Then, everything changed. That afternoon, Charles and Andrew went out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I needed the space, the time to clear my head, to remind myself that whatever this was between Andrew and me had to end. But when they returned, my resolve shattered. I was curled up on the couch when they walked in, laughing about something I didn't quite catch. Charles dropped his keys on the table and went straight to the fridge for a drink, barely acknowledging me. Andrew, on the other hand, walked straight toward me. And in his hand was a small, familiar box. Chocolate. My favorite brand. The one I had casually mentioned in passing, not thinking much of it. He held it out to me, his eyes locked on mine, a small knowing smile playing at his lips. Saw this and thought of you. I froze. Not because of the chocolate itself, but because he had been listening. He had remembered something so small, so insignificant, and had gone out of his way to buy it for me. In front of Charles. And Charles? He didn't even react. Didn't question it. Didn't wonder why his best friend was bringing his girlfriend gifts. He just chuckled, popping open his soda. You and your sweet tooth, he said lightly, completely oblivious to the electricity crackling between Andrew and me. I took the box slowly, my fingers brushing against Andrew's. A jolt of warmth shot up my arm, and I knew he felt it too. His gaze held mine for a second too long, as if daring me to acknowledge what was happening. That was the moment I knew. Knew that the way Andrew looked at me made me feel more seen than Charles ever had. Knew that the way my heart raced in Andrew's presence was something I had never felt with my own boyfriend. Knew that I had been fighting the wrong battle all along. It wasn't about resisting Andrew. It was about admitting the truth. I wasn't in love with Charles. I was falling for Andrew. I stared at the box of chocolate in my hands, my fingers tracing the edges as if it were some forbidden treasure. Andrew had given it to me in front of Charles, in front of my boyfriend, and Charles had been completely blind to what was unfolding right before him. But I wasn't blind. Not anymore. When I finally looked up, Andrew was still watching me. His eyes, dark and knowing, held something unspoken, something that made my breath hitch. He knew. He had always known. And now I was done pretending. That night, as Charles lay asleep beside me, his soft snores filling the room, I couldn't stop thinking about Andrew. About the way he had looked at me when he handed me the chocolate. About how my heart had pounded just from the brush of his fingers against mine. I turned onto my side, staring at the ceiling, my body restless. Why was I still here? With Charles? A man who barely noticed me? A man who never paid attention to the small details, who had never made my skin tingle with a single glance. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was Andrew. His smirk, his touch, the way he had been silently calling to me, waiting for me to acknowledge what had been growing between us. And finally, I was ready to stop running. Slipping out of bed as quietly as possible, I tiptoed out of the room, my heart pounding. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I moved through the hallway, guided by something deeper than thought, something primal, something inevitable. I stopped in front of Andrew's door, my fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. One turn, one step, and everything changes. I hesitated for only a second. Then I opened the door. Andrew was sitting on the edge of his bed, shirtless, his phone in his hand. He looked up immediately, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if he had been waiting. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The air between us crackled, thick with everything we had refused to say. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Andrew stood, closing the distance between us in slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught as he reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, sending a shiver through me. "You're sure about this?" he murmured, his voice deep, steady. I swallowed hard. I wasn't just sure. I was certain. Instead of answering, I lifted my hand, trailing my fingers down his chest, feeling the heat of his skin beneath my touch. His breath hitched, and that small reaction sent a thrill through me. Andrew let out a slow exhale, his fingers sliding beneath my chin, tilting my face up toward his. Our eyes met, and in that moment, nothing else existed. Not Charles. Not guilt. Not logic. Just us. And when his lips finally met mine, it wasn't hesitation. It was release. The moment Andrew's lips touched mine, something inside me snapped. It wasn't hesitation or uncertainty anymore. It was need. A deep, undeniable hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. His hands slipped down my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I melted into the heat of his body. Every touch, every movement sent sparks through me, awakening something I had never felt before. Not with Charles. Never with Charles. I tilted my head, deepening the kiss, my fingers tangling in his hair. Andrew groaned softly, his grip tightening, as if he had been holding himself back for too long. But just as his hands started to explore, I broke away, breathless. "We shouldn't be doing this," I whispered, my forehead resting against his. Andrew's fingers traced slow circles on my waist. "But do you want to stop?" I swallowed, my heart pounding. The answer was obvious. No. I didn't want to stop. Instead of answering, I pulled him back to me, claiming his lips with a hunger that surprised even me. This wasn't just desire. This was surrender. From that night on, there was no going back. We stole moments when Charles wasn't looking. Long, lingering glances across the room, secret touches when we passed each other, whispered conversations in the dead of the night. And when Charles was asleep, We devoured each other. In the kitchen, against the hallway wall, behind locked doors. We didn't care. The risk only made it more intoxicating. Andrew never rushed me, never pushed beyond what I was ready for. But each time we came together, it was fire. Burning, consuming, inevitable. And the more time I spent with him, the more I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just cheating on Charles, I was falling for Andrew. But the more we indulged, the more harder it became to hide. One evening, while Charles was in the shower, Andrew and I were in the kitchen. I was standing by the sink when he walked up behind me, his hands sliding over my hips, his lips ghosting over my neck. I leaned into him, my body reaching instantly. "We need to be careful," I murmured, though I didn't make any effort to pull away. Andrew smirked, his teeth grazing my ear. "You say that every time." I exhaled sharply, tilting my head as his lips traveled lower. "And yet you keep making it impossible to stop." He chuckled, his hands gripping my waist. "Because you don't want to stop." And I didn't. But just then, we heard a noise. Footsteps. Andrew pulled away just in time for Charles to step into the kitchen, towel slung over his shoulder. "You guys okay?" he asked, grabbing a drink from the fridge. I forced a casual smile, my heart still racing. "Yeah, just talking." Andrew leaned against the counter, completely unfazed. "I was just telling her how much she's starting to enjoy my company." I shot him a warning glare, but he only smirked. Charles laughed, oblivious. "Well, I am glad. Andrew's like a brother to me. You two getting along makes things easier." I swallowed hard. If only he knew. The secret moments, the stolen touches, the quiet gasps in the dark. It had gone on for too long. Each night with Andrew left me wanting more, sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. But secrets like this don't stay hidden forever. And I should have known that sooner or later, Charles would find out. It happened on a Saturday evening. We had just finished dinner, and Charles had stepped out to take a phone call. Andrew and I were left alone in the living room. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, pretending like nothing was wrong. But Andrew? He was watching me, the same way he always did. I felt the heat of his gaze, the way his eyes traveled over me as if he was undressing me with his mind. And for the first time, I didn't fight it. I looked right back at him. Something unspoken passed between us. An invitation. A promise. And then, I did something reckless. I reached out and touched his hand. Just a brief moment. Just my fingers grazing over his skin. But Charles saw. He had walked back inside at the exact moment, his voice dying mid-sentence as his eyes fell on our hands. Silence. A long, painful silence. I snatched my hand back as if I had been burned, my heart slamming against my ribs. Charles's face twisted in confusion. "What the hell is that?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Andrew, however, didn't flinch. He simply leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. Charles took a step closer, his eyes darting between us. I asked a question. "What the hell was that?" His voice wasn't angry. Not yet. It was worse. It was calm. The kind of calm that came before a storm. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "It was nothing, babe. Just nothing." Charles cut me off, his eyes narrowing. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell didn't look like nothing. Andrew sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Charles." "Don't," Charles snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "Don't you dare talk right now." His gaze swung back to me, and for the first time, I saw something that made my stomach churn. Doubt. "You've been acting strange lately," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "And now this." He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Tell me the truth. Right now." My throat tightened. "Charles, But before I could finish, Andrew stood up. And what he said next changed everything. "She doesn't love you, Charles." The words sliced through the air like a blade. My entire body went numb. Charles's face went pale. For a second, he didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then, very slowly, he turned to face Andrew. "What the hell did you just say?" Andrew didn't back down. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. She's been lying to herself.
To you. But she doesn't love you, man.
Not the way you think she does. Andrew, stop, I whispered, my voice shaking. But it was too late. Because the moment those words left Andrew's mouth, everything fell apart.